A year after losing his teenage daughter and wife in a car crash, a broken billionaire CEO out for a walk in the park freezes in shock at the sight of a girl, sitting on a bench, who looks exactly like his daughter. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The sprawling glass walls of Dominic Grant's penthouse offered a panoramic view of the city, but the sight was lost on him. It had been for a long time. The skyline, once a source of pride and inspiration, now felt like a bleak expanse, a reminder of how little the world cared for the suffering of one man, no matter how rich or powerful he was. The world kept moving, the city lights still glittered, and the hum of life below continued unabated. But for Dominic, time had stopped a year ago. The silence in his home was oppressive. Julia's laughter and Lena's chatter no longer echoed in the halls, yet their absence was deafening. Their photos still adorned the walls, smiling down at him like ghosts. He avoided looking at them, but he couldn't bring himself to take them down either. His once lavish home now felt like a mausoleum, each room a shrine to the life he had lost. The dining table, where they used to share meals, was now covered in unopened mail and abandoned paperwork. His bedroom was untouched, her side of the closet still full of Julia's clothes, her favorite scarf draped over the chair where she had left it. Lena's room remained frozen in time, her bed neatly made, her books still lying on the desk where she'd last placed them. Dominic had thrown himself into his work in the aftermath of the accident, a desperate attempt to escape the crushing weight of his grief. His company, Grant Technologies, had become his refuge, his distraction. The endless board meetings, product launches, and business trips allowed him to fill the hours, to drown out the ache in his chest. He told himself he was doing what needed to be done, keeping the company afloat, honoring the legacy he had built for his family. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was running. The people around him had tried, at first, to break through the walls he had erected. His closest friends called regularly, offering to take him out or simply sit with him. His assistant, Mara, left gentle reminders about therapy appointments on his desk, sometimes walking into his office to urge him to go. Even his therapist had reached out directly, concerned by his sudden withdrawal. Dominic ignored them all, burying himself deeper into his work, refusing to confront the gaping chasm of loss that threatened to swallow him whole. Tonight was no different. The day had been grueling, a blur of meetings and decisions he barely remembered making. By the time he returned home, the exhaustion was more emotional than physical. He dropped his briefcase by the door and loosened his tie, staring blankly at the dimly lit living room. The emptiness of the space seemed to mock him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his usual ritual, and sat on the edge of the couch, staring at nothing in particular. The burn of the alcohol was familiar, grounding him in a way that nothing else could. Yet tonight, it wasn't enough. The silence pressed in harder, the walls seemed to close in, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. He set the glass down and stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. The idea came to him unbidden, a walk. He hadn't been to the park since the accident. It had been one of their favorite places, a sanctuary in the middle of the bustling city. He and Julia used to take Lena there every Sunday, feeding the ducks, renting bikes, or simply sitting on a bench and watching the world go by. The mere thought of returning to that place made his chest tighten, but something compelled him to go. Perhaps it was the need to escape the suffocating stillness of his home, or perhaps it was the whiskey loosening his defenses. Either way, he found himself stepping out into the crisp night air, the city alive with the hum of traffic and distant laughter. The park was quieter than he remembered, the paths dimly lit by old-fashioned lampposts. The trees, their branches bare in the late autumn chill, cast long shadows across the ground. Dominic stuffed his hands into his coat pockets, his breath clouding the air in front of him. He walked aimlessly, his mind drifting to memories he had tried so hard to suppress. He could almost hear Lena's laughter, see her running ahead to chase a squirrel or beg for ice cream. He could picture Julia's warm smile as she watched their daughter, her hands slipping into his. The ache in his chest grew sharper, and he shook his head, trying to dispel the images. As he rounded a bend in the path, he came to a small clearing with a row of benches. A soft murmur of voices reached his ears, and his eyes were drawn to a pair of figures sitting on one of the benches. Two teenage girls, their heads close together as they laughed at something on a phone. Dominic froze mid-step. One of the girls turned slightly, her face catching the light of the nearby lamppost, and Dominic's heart stopped. It was Lena. Or at least, it could have been. She looked exactly like his daughter, same chestnut waves spilling over her shoulders, the same bright eyes that seemed to sparkle even in the dim light. She laughed again, the sound piercing through Dominic like a blade. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. It wasn't possible. Lena was gone. He had buried her. He had stood at her graveside, numb and broken, as they lowered the casket into the ground. And yet here she was. His legs moved on their own, carrying him a few steps closer. His pulse thundered in his ears, and his vision blurred as tears welled up. He wanted to call out to her, to say her name, but his voice caught in his throat. The girl glanced up, her gaze briefly meeting his. Dominic stopped in his tracks. It wasn't her. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The girl's smile faltered as she noticed him staring, her brows knitting together in confusion. Her friend leaned in, whispering something, and they both stood, walking away quickly. Dominic stood there, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, grief, hope, despair, and something else he couldn't quite name. He sank onto the bench they had just vacated, burying his face in his hands. The ache in his chest was unbearable, but for the first time in a year, it felt raw and real, not dulled by the numbness he had wrapped himself in. He sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of his grief pressing down on him like never before. The image of the girl lingered in his mind, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. And yet there was something about her, something that stirred a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It terrified him. But it also refused to be ignored. Dominic's mind raced as he sat frozen on the park bench, his heart pounding like a drum. He couldn't shake the image, couldn't untangle the knot of emotions tightening in his chest. It wasn't just the resemblance, it was her, Lena. The same dark, wavy hair that caught the sunlight like his daughter's once did, the same small nose dusted with freckles, and those eyes, bright, curious, alive. Memories surged, unbidden and sharp, of Lena's laughter echoing through the house, her tiny hands slipping into his as they crossed the street, her voice calling him, Dad, in that special way only she could. But Lena was gone. She had been gone for years. He knew this with every aching fiber of his being. And yet there she was, or someone who looked impossibly like her, walking through the park on an ordinary autumn afternoon. He sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, trying to will away the image, to convince himself it was some cruel trick of light and shadow, a momentary misfiring of his grief-stricken brain. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became. He wasn't imagining it. She was real. Or at least, someone who looked exactly like her was. The logical part of his mind fought against the rising tide of hope, whispering that it couldn't be her, that this was just a coincidence. But the rest of him, the part that had never stopped grieving, never stopped blaming himself for her death, clung to the possibility with ferocious desperation. What if it was her? What if, somehow, against every law of nature and reason, Lena had come back? Before he could stop himself, Dominic rose from the bench, his legs unsteady beneath him. He felt like a man walking through a dream, every step toward her weighted with equal parts dread and longing. She stood near the fountain, laughing at something her friend had said, her voice carrying faintly on the breeze. It was so achingly familiar that his breath caught in his throat. He hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground, as doubt crept in again. What if he was wrong? What if this was just a stranger, some poor girl who happened to share his daughter's face? But no, He couldn't shake the certainty that this was no coincidence. He had to know. Lena? The name left his lips before he even realized he had spoken, his voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. The girl turned, her smile fading as she noticed him. Her expression shifted to one of confusion, her brow furrowing as she studied his face. "I'm sorry, what?" she said, her voice cautious but polite. Dominic's heart clenched. Even her voice was the same. "Lena," he repeated, more insistently this time, stepping closer. "It's me, Dad." The girl blinked, clearly taken aback. "I think you have the wrong person," she said, glancing nervously at her friend. "My name's Emily, not Lena." Dominic froze, his mind struggling to make sense of her words. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that's not right. You're Lena. You have to be." Emily took a small step back, her unease growing. "I don't know who you are," she said, her tone edging toward alarm. "I've never seen you before. But you look just like her." Dominic stammered, his voice rising. "You look exactly like my daughter. You have to understand, she died years ago. I thought I lost her forever, but here you are. You're here." Emily exchanged a nervous glance with her friend, who tugged at her arm. "Come on, Emily," the friend whispered. "Let's go." "I'm sorry," Emily said quickly, her eyes darting between Dominic and her friend. "I don't know you." She turned and walked away, her steps hurried, her friend close behind. "Wait," Dominic called after her, his voice breaking. "Please, just wait. I need to talk to you." But she didn't stop. He watched helplessly as she disappeared down the path, his heart sinking into a pit of despair. Dominic stood there for a long time, unable to move, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and desperation. He replayed the encounter over and over in his head, searching for some explanation, some clue that would make sense of it all. She had denied being Lena, but how could he believe her? The resemblance was too perfect, too exact. It wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she moved, the way she smiled, the way she tilted her head when she was confused. It was Lena. He was sure of it. And yet she had looked at him like he was a stranger, like she had never seen him before in her life. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Dominic finally forced himself to leave. His legs felt heavy as he walked back to his car, his mind still reeling. He needed answers. He needed to understand who Emily was and why she looked so much like his daughter. Was it possible that Lena had somehow survived, that she had been taken from him and given a new identity? Or was this something else entirely, something he couldn't explain, or even comprehend? That night, Dominic sat alone in his darkened living room, staring at a photograph of Lena that he had taken just weeks before her death. She was smiling at the camera, her arms wrapped around the family dog, her eyes sparkling with mischief. It was the same smile he had seen today, the same eyes that had looked at him with confusion and fear. He traced the outline of her face with his finger, his heart aching with a longing that had never fully gone away. He decided then and there that he couldn't let it go. He had to find out the truth, no matter how painful or difficult it might be. If there was even the slightest chance that Emily was Lena, he owed it to his daughter, and to himself, to uncover the answers. He thought about following her, about finding out where she lived, who her parents were, what her life was like. The idea made him feel sick, like he was crossing some invisible line, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was too important to ignore. The next day, Dominic returned to the park, hoping to see her again. He sat on the same bench, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of her. Hours passed, but there was no sign of Emily, or Lena, as he still thought of her. He felt a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. What if he never saw her again? What if this was his only chance, and he had let it slip through his fingers? But just as he was about to leave, he caught a glimpse of her in the distance. She was walking with a group of friends, laughing and talking, completely unaware of his presence. His heart leapt in his chest, a mixture of relief and anxiety flooding through him. He wanted to approach her, to call out her name, but he hesitated. What if she reacted the same way as before? What if he scared her off for good? He couldn't risk it. Instead, he decided to follow at a distance, keeping her in sight but staying far enough away that she wouldn't notice him. He felt a pang of guilt for what he was doing, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't just about him. This was about Lena, about finding out the truth, about making sense of the impossible. He watched as she and her friends left the park and headed toward a nearby coffee shop. He lingered outside, pretending to be engrossed in his phone, his eyes flicking toward the window every few seconds to make sure she was still there. As he stood there, the weight of what he was doing began to sink in. He knew it wasn't right to follow her like this, to invade her privacy, but he couldn't stop himself. He felt like a man possessed, driven by a need he couldn't fully explain. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away, not yet, not without answers. Dominic sat alone in the dimly lit room, the silence pressing against him like a weight he couldn't bear. The air was heavy with the echoes of his conversation with Lena, her words still ricocheting in his mind. She had been so certain, so insistent, that Emily wasn't just another stranger. It wasn't just her eyes, her mannerisms, or the way she seemed to know things about Lena that no outsider should. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at Dominic's heart and refused to let go. He couldn't dismiss it as coincidence any longer, nor could he simply write it off as the whimsical imagination of a grieving daughter. There was more to this, and he needed answers. It was this gnawing doubt that drove him to action. That night, after Lena had finally fallen asleep, Dominic sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. His fingers trembled as he scrolled through the contacts of local investigators, his mind racing with questions. Who was Emily, really? Why had she appeared in their lives so suddenly? And why did she seem so connected to Lena? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial, something that had been hidden in the shadows of their lives. With a deep breath, he made the call. A crisp, professional voice answered, and within minutes, Dominic had hired a private investigator to look into Emily's background. It felt surreal, like stepping into a story he didn't fully understand, but he knew he couldn't stop now. The days that followed were torturous, filled with nervous anticipation and an undercurrent of dread. The investigator had promised results, but waiting for them felt like an eternity. Dominic tried to focus on work, on Lena, on anything that could distract him, but the weight of uncertainty pressed too heavily on his chest. Lena, too, seemed more withdrawn than ever, her quiet moments filled with an unspoken grief that mirrored his own. She still talked about Emily, though Dominic had forbidden her to search for the girl online or reach out to her again. He feared what they might uncover, but even more, he feared the growing bond between his daughter and the stranger who had upended their lives. When the investigator finally called, Dominic's heart raced as he answered the phone. The man's voice was steady, almost detached, as he began to explain what he had uncovered. The truth unraveled slowly, each word piercing Dominic like a blade. Emily wasn't just anyone. She wasn't just a girl with a striking resemblance to Lena. She was Lena's twin. The revelation hit Dominic like a freight train, leaving him breathless and reeling. Twins? He thought back to the day Lena was born, the overwhelming joy he had felt, the pride of becoming a father. How could he not have known? How could he have been so blind? The investigator's words continued, each revelation more devastating than the last. His wife, Lena's mother, had been pregnant with 2 daughters. But while Dominic had been away on an important work trip, she had made a decision that would forever alter their lives. She had given one of the twins up for adoption. Dominic's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of this unimaginable truth. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she carried this secret for so many years? The answer, when it came, was a bitter pill to swallow. She had feared that Dominic was too consumed by his career to handle the responsibility of raising 2 children. She had made the decision alone, believing it was in their best interests, but in doing so, she had built a wall of silence that now threatened to crush them all. The phone call ended, but Dominic couldn't move. His hands shook as he clutched the phone, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, grief, guilt, they swirled together, threatening to consume him. He felt betrayed by his late wife, the woman he had trusted more than anyone else. But more than that, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Not only had he lost a daughter he had never known, but he had also been robbed of the chance to love her, to be her father. And now, years later, he was faced with the consequences of that decision, a broken family and a daughter who had suffered in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Dominic knew he had to find Emily. He had to know the truth of her life, to understand what had happened to her after she was given up. Fueled by a mixture of guilt and desperation, he threw himself into the search. Days turned into nights as he sifted through records, reaching out to the investigator for updates and following every lead, no matter how small. It was as if his entire world hinged on finding her, on making sense of the pain that had suddenly engulfed their lives. When he finally found her, the truth was more heartbreaking than he could have imagined. Emily had not been adopted into a loving family as he had hoped. Instead, she had been placed in the foster system, where she had bounced from home to home, each more unstable than the last. The investigator's report was thorough, outlining years of neglect and hardship. Emily's childhood had been a patchwork of broken promises and shattered dreams, her life marked by a lack of stability and care. Dominic could hardly bring himself to read the details, the weight of her suffering pressing down on him like